So we got these reports, which I don't think are particularly surprising. This was something that had been speculated
for quite a while.
Exactly. And now you think that it wouldn't be a surprise to actually see Trump try to make this kind of a move.
Well, I think if this investigation ends up ensnaring Jared Kushner or Donald Trump Jr., and of course the president himself, then of course Donald Trump will fire Bob Mueller. I don't think he'll even think twice about doing it. And at that point, if the stakes are that high and his family members are involved, I don't think he'll care about issues that Don McGahn cared about last June. Remember,
such as whether it's legal to do so, for example.
Are you trying to get around an obstruction of justice investigation by obstructing justice? And are you failing to sort of recognize the necessary independence of the Justice Department and the FBI? Those are big issues. In the years since that happened, Mueller is indicted for Trump insiders. The investigation has become more broad-based. There's more reasons for Trump to fear it. And he is yet to actually start to pull the trigger on going after people closer to the Oval Office itself.
So this happened last June, but we're hearing about it now, which is kind of curious.
Great question.
A lot of people think that the news that we're getting from inside the White House are being leaked by members of the White House, the members of the administration. Who would be leaking? Well, assuming someone inside the White House is leaking this, why would they be doing so right now?
Well, it's also interesting that this broke when President Trump was on his way to Switzerland, so he was safely incommunicado. So if you're also speculating why people in the White House maneuvered to get this information out, one could conjecture that they were worried about the same thing they were worried last June, that he was contemplating firing Mueller again. Remember, right before he left for Davos, he gave that impromptu press conference in the Oval Office where he said he would love to sit down with Bob Mueller when he got back, maybe in 2 or 3 weeks, immediately freaking out his lawyers, who then had to walk that statement back and say, well, we're not sure what will happen. And the president, of course, will have to listen to the advice of his counsel. And, of course, the president never listens to the advice of his counsel. So I think all of them have been trying over the past year to figure out how do you maneuver the president into a position to make responsible decisions and do the right thing. And I suspect there had been more chatter inside the White House that he was thinking about firing Mueller again.
Interesting.
In your column for Bloomberg View, you call the president a survivor to his core, and that's sort of core to his identity. Looking back through his career, are there any parallels where there was some big decision that maybe seemed like it was good survivorship tactic, but also potentially very self-damaging?
Well, and being a survivor, it's one of his strengths. Right. And he's had a long, knotty career in the public eye and in business in New York, and he's gotten past all of that stuff. I think probably the most direct comparison in his business life was when he almost went personally bankrupt in the early 1990s. And he had guaranteed $900 million or so in debt. He was in hock to the banks for over $3 billion in debt. He had been spending money pell-mell. He hadn't spent it judiciously, and the banks came calling and wanted to be paid back. And his life was sort of falling. His marriage was falling apart around him. And he began lashing out at everyone around him and ended up very isolated during that period.
Your colleague Jonathan Bernstein of Bloomberg View says that this whole episode, hearing about how he wanted to fire Bob Mueller back in June, shows how weak this president is, that White House staffers are overruling him. He wrote that, in general, most presidents are constrained by the strong incentives the job provides to, for example, establish a reputation for honesty. Most presidents don't avoid obvious lies because they're ethical, but because it's smart to do so. Trump ignores those incentives. He is, compared to most presidents, apt to do almost anything. This is clearly a shoot from the hip, you could say carpe diem kind of president. How does that play itself out in a deposition?
Oh, he's the worst witness a lawyer could probably ever have in a deposition because of everything you just said, Scarlet. He doesn't prepare. He's got a very short attention span. He doesn't like to read. Lawyers carefully prep witnesses for a deposition. They get binders full of material if they have to study. Trump never does that. Truth is a good thing to have in a deposition. It's bad to tell lies during a deposition. Donald Trump is a serial fabulist. It's very hard for him not only to stay on message, but to tell the truth. That's a problem in a deposition. And lastly, he is so consumed with the idea that he's the first mover on everything that even if he was being questioned in a deposition about an event in which it would be useful for him to say, oh, no, that was one of my deputy's decisions.
To pass the buck.
To pass the buck. He never does because I'm the mover, I'm the man, I make it happen. That's also, he's nitroglycerin in a deposition.